Hey, welcome to the Ron Lanscombe Executive in Residence Lecture Series. Little background. The Ron Lanscombe Executive in Residence Series was created to bring experienced professionals, often UNK grads, to campus to share their long list of accomplishments and experiences and so forth with their students, faculty, staff, and oftentimes the community. At CBT, for years, we believed that blending theory and practice through experiential learning from undergrads to grads, that learning by doing is simply more effective. Lectures like you'll experience today are part of that, an important part of that experience, and I'm glad you are here to hear from our executive in residence, Mr. Dick Wiles. Mr. Wiles is a Kearney State grad. As a graduate assistant here as well, he was recruited by EDS to go to work for them and design and develop a system for First National Bank in Lincoln, Nebraska. He rose from through the ranks at EDS, taking on various roles that helped him grow his skill set. In the mid-'80s, while he was managing EDS's global training program, he was presented with an opportunity to manage the relationship between EDS and the U.S. Olympic and Paralympic Committee. That was the start of his 3-decade run in the sports world. From there, he went on to be CEO of a tech company based in Switzerland called Eurotech. Eurotech was the sole provider for FIFA, which gave him the opportunity to be highly involved in the planning, implementation, and management of IT services in many World Cups, I think 7, if I recall correctly. FIFA eventually decided to, that they would absorb Eurotech and bought them out and hired Mr. Wiles as their CIO. Overall, he has 38 years of experience in the IT industry, 27 years in management and delivery of systems and services for very large sports events and organizations, and has managed large cross-functional teams for short and large periods of time across supporting and delivering IT services in a number of international locations, including, like I said, the last 7 World Cups. As I was kind of going through this, I thought to myself, how would you kind of summarize his career? And it kind of came to me, when opportunity knocks, answer the door. And he's done it a lot throughout his career. So we're very excited to have Mr. Wiles here and learn from him. And because he wants an open discussion, please feel free to ask questions.
Thanks, Tim. Boy, that's a lot of time I've spent doing this stuff. It's amazing I've done it I'm only 35, so most of you, I wish. First of all, there's a couple of items. I'm required by contract to mention that, I apologize to Tim in advance, that FIFA would have, it's okay. Many people in FIFA, other countries have called it PIPA. I don't know what it is, but it is FIFA, who has been under I was employed by them for the last 4 years, 2015 to 2018, and also have been one of their contractors for a number of years. So of that period of time, I can appreciate. The other thing I have to apologize in advance for is that I just got off spending the last week with 2 individuals, one of age 3 and one of age 1. She will be 3. She is not 3. So if I go to baby talk right away, I apologize in advance. It just happens when you're a grandfather of 11. So the last thing I want to mention is, and I appreciate the fact that the introduction had a number of opportunities and accomplishments and so forth, but one does not accomplish this by themselves. It just doesn't happen. There's a team of people that I've worked with over the years who have been part of this. I've just happened to be around and led them during the time of their success. So I've been a benefactor of that success because we collectively did these things. So I just want to make sure that I mention that. I'm very glad to be here. I am, as was mentioned, I am a graduate of Kearney State, UNK. At that time, I was Kearney State. And I'm from Kearney originally. Anyone else from Kearney in the room? I don't know. Bearcats or stars, or both? There we go, Bearcats. You can go into a fight song if you want. I can't remember it actually. No, but I appreciate the fact that I'm here. I'd like to be able to say, I thought about how to start out today's presentation because there's a lot of information to cover, but I was going to say that when I was in your shoes, since many of you are students here, but that wouldn't be fair because the shoes I was in 1974, 73, 77 were not even anything near like your shoes. I mean, my shoes were not even close to from a technology perspective, which is a major part of this topic, it's not even close to what you have to deal with. The one thing I will say, sort of a comparison, is that when I was in the work study program here, I worked at the KSC, Kearney State Data Center, was an operator on an IBM 360. Now, many of you don't know what I mean by that, but it's a computer that at that time would take up most of the size of the room behind us, and had the biggest challenges were hanging magnetic tapes and making sure that the punch cards were always in the right order when you loaded them on the machine. The other comparison I would make is that the device that I now have in my pocket, my mobile phone, has about 400,000, or 40,000, shouldn't jump a zero, I'm a math major, 40,000 times the power, both in storage and in memory, than that machine had in that room. So my shoes aren't like your shoes. Your shoes are much bigger to fill. Your shoes, but some of the same opportunities, some of the same types of expectations will be there, but some of them are much, much different, much, much greater. From a technology perspective, there'll be quite a bit of difference between what my shoes had and what your shoes had. In order to get through things, I don't want to spend a lot of time on my background, but I do think there are some, as I go through my history of how I got to be where I am, I do want to acknowledge a couple of key decisions. They talk about the doors that had opened. I want us to look at some of those doors and how they opened and how random some things happened in your life. Okay, I mean, this was where I was here. I was a graduate of Kearney High. I went to Kearney State, and I was, one of the things I mentioned to some of the earlier groups is when I went here to school, I knew what I was going to do. I was going to be a high school math coach, a math teacher, and a football coach. That's what I was going to do. And I had a driver's ed endorsement, so I was willing to take risk. But honestly, I knew exactly what I was going to do. And my focus and my curriculum, what I took here, was based on that. When I graduated, the one thing that happened is I then was asked to stay on to complete my master's degree, which I did. I got a flavor for teaching as a graduate assistant. Kept on as teaching a little bit here after that. But then in the process, I was approached by a company called Electronic Data Systems, known in the industry as EDS. EDS, for those that may or may not know it, was a company that was owned by Ross Perot, who unfortunately passed away recently. But he had a definite way of managing a company. It was a very successful company. And they came on campus to hire graduates from Kearney because of the type of people that they were and because of the background they were getting, which is not surprising. But one day, after hiring several of those individuals, as I was finishing my master's degree in teaching, I was asked, well, Dick, what about you? Would you want to go do this? And I said, no, come on. No, I'm going to be a high school math teacher and a football coach. And he said, well, what about if I offer you X? And I said, okay, when do I go? I don't mean to make it not so flippant as it was, because my wife Nancy can tell you that it wasn't that flippant. It was a very long discussion that we had. But I made a decision, the door opened and I went through it. It was one I thought I would never go through, but I did. And was there for a period of time and led to moving from Lincoln, Nebraska, then on to Dallas, Texas, where EDS is based, and eventually ran their entry-level management program, entry-level technical program called the Systems Engineer Development Program for a number of years. And had exposure to several senior VPs and so forth in the company. And one of them had just come back from a trip to Europe where EDS had signed a new sponsorship agreement for the Barcelona Olympics. And Tom Bockold was his name. Tom was a great guy. And he said, Dick, we want you to go manage the delivery of these services in Spain, not moving to Spain, obviously, but as a corporate perspective, help manage the people that go and where they come from. There's one problem. We've done this because we want a sponsorship with the Olympics, but this agreement only gets us to, as most sponsorships, they're geographically bound, only gets us rights in this country of Spain, where we had no business in Spain. So it was quite the situation. So I was asked then to facilitate a relationship with one of the national organizing committees, several national organizing committees, NOCs they're called, one of which was the USOC. And in that point, I moved from Dallas to Colorado Springs, Colorado, where my home has been since then. My wife would question that, but that's where I live. And with there to be part of a relationship that managed the sponsorship for the Barcelona Olympics, the EDS had delivery services, and to the U.S. Olympic Committee. EDS then had so much success with that event that they then signed on for many other types of activities. We had a contract, we were then owned by General Motors. So we established relationships with several motorsports, including NASCAR. I know there are NASCAR fans in the room. And so the NASCAR, Indy Racing League was another, and Formula One. We had some Formula One events in Australia that we did. And from that, it progressed into relationship for supporting World Cup in '94 with the U.S., when it was held here in the U.S. Now, one thing that I will mention to you also is that my experience in some of these sports, I'm not a race car driver, obviously, but knowing the sports, I mean, I've watched them on TV and did different things, but the sport of soccer, I knew nothing about. I mean, I was asked to coach, as most American fathers are asked to coach my son, who was then 4, to play soccer. So I knew about, if you take kids and pack them on a soccer pitch and have them run them down the field, that's what I knew about soccer. Until my son turned about 9 or 10 when I was coaching the team, and one of the players' fathers was from Colombia. And I said, well, I'm going to help with the World Cup. And he looks at me and goes, the World Cup? His eyes got huge. And I said, well, yeah, it's this event that's being held in the U.S. And he goes, you're going to, this is the World Cup. We have no appreciation for the sport. I had no appreciation for the sport until I got involved at that point. The door opened and I walked through it. And from that, we helped participate in the '94 World Cup as a sponsor. EDS was a sponsor. And in '98 in France. So that door opened and we walked through it. Then the door closed. Dick Brown, who became CEO of EDS, changed strategies. He said, we're no longer going to be active in the delivery of sport marketing through active sponsorship. We're going to go do commercials. And as I said to groups earlier, if you want to go to YouTube and look up herding cats, there's a video called Herding Cats. It was a Super Bowl commercial where we had cowboys on horses herding little kitty cats. And the relationship was, IT is like herding cats, moving cats over. If some of you are shaking your head, you remember it. I'm shocked. But anyway, it was a famous commercial, but the change was made. And the marketing portion of the company went away. And they basically said, we're not going to do this anymore. FIFA then came to me and said, well, Dick, we can't do without what you do, so let's do something. So we established a company in Switzerland. Obviously, this is the first company I've ever established in Switzerland, and the only company I've ever established in Switzerland. So we built this company around the expertise of individuals from the previous 2 World Cups in France and the US, and helped support FIFA then for a period from 2000 to 2014. As you can see, that involves both women's and men's World Cups during that period, And we went from Japan, Korea, to Germany, to South Africa, to Brazil, in that window of opportunity over the period of time that we were there. And when I say this, it's not, FIFA has events, not just the World Cup events, which are the magnitude, the major event, but also a myriad of other events for other age groups and so forth, and awards that take place. So it's not just the paramount games that we're talking about. But that was during the period from 2000 to 2014. Then FIFA made a decision at the end, going into the 2014 World Cup, that they would begin to, as many sports organizations are doing now, we want to bring key critical services inside and be managed inside the organization rather than outside. So they decided we're going to bring people into FIFA. So again, the door opened. The Secretary General of FIFA then asked me, well, Dick, will you come work for us rather than working where you are? And I don't know if any of you know about the climate of FIFA at that time. It was not a great climate at that point. But I said, okay, let's do it. So I came inside and for a 4-year period was a resident in Switzerland and lived there and managed the event as the head IT and CIO for FIFA for the past 4 years. Obviously during that period was an event of Women's World Cup in Canada and then the Men's World Cup in Russia. So those are the two major events, plus all the other events that FIFA has. So that's sort of the history of the doors. And then at the end of that World Cup, it became obvious that I wanted to be more US-centric, spend more time here. So we came back to the US and now have limited consulting engagements with some of the events, including the 2 World Cups which are coming up, one in 2022, which is in Qatar. We can talk a little about that if you wish, or the one in 2026, which is the United bid, which is the Canadian, US, Mexico bid for the World Cup that will happen in 2026 in those 3 countries, which will have some uniqueness to it as well. So over the next few minutes, I just want to cover a few things which are sort of major events, major elements and events that take place. First of all, a video. Okay, the next few slides we'll talk basically about gives you some understanding of the event life cycle that is part of a World Cup. This gives an illustration of going from Brazil to Russia, but the important thing is they talk about the 6.5 years or the 6 years leading up to a World Cup. It's not just the event itself that you deal with. There are a number of parallel activities. We do, we set up offices in those countries. There's inspections. About 80%, 85 to 90% of the stadiums are either new build or rebuild stadiums. So all of them go through an inspection process where we visit twice a year, basically between the period of the beginning of the process to the end. And in the final year, several times more than that, to make sure that they're following the guidelines that are given. We manage market activities, the corporate social responsibility programs, the types of programs that are also part of it. We have workshops going on, and then obviously in-country operational contacts. The path on the right really talks about the different types of activities. Each is an event of itself. There are different draws, and there are test events. We call them test events, same terminology as in the Olympic Games, where they put on events that simulate what's going on, leading from one event to the next. The life cycle has some key phases as already brought up in the video, but there's an iteration process. The design and development goes on an ongoing basis, but the integration, deployment, the operations, and the deinstallation process happens quite heavily in sort of a rotating or iterative process. And the deinstallation process is interesting because as some people like to use the analogy, during the time of a 6-year period and through the World Cup, we are building what is basically by statistics or by numbers the equivalent to a Fortune 500 company within the host country. And then at the very end, we have about a month to take it away. So in about the month following the event, everything goes out of the country, thereabouts. Major areas of consideration, we can't do this without sponsorship. So we'll talk a little about sponsorship. There's different types of operational contribution. You might hear me use the word value in kind, which basically means instead of paying cash, many providers provide colored sugar water, beer, hamburgers, I don't know, other things which have value. In our case, they have IT services they provide in lieu of providing cash. But there are iterations of what the overall value needs to be. The other point, which is very important to understand, besides the key role that sponsors plays, is that there are government guarantees. There are, for the World Cups that we have, there are about 17, 18, depending upon the year, government guarantees which a government, a federal government, needs to sign to say they will do certain things. To make it clear, the World Cup is awarded to a host country, to a host federation. So USA Soccer, for example, would be the host federation, one of the host federations for the 2026 World Cup. They will create what's called a local organizing committee, a group of people they will designate outside of the federation who will actually run the event. And that organization then is responsible for running it. But on top of that, the federal government for any particular country has to sign on to guarantee certain aspects of what needs to happen to FIFA and to FIFA constituents. Just to give you a couple examples, I used those earlier in some discussions, but I'll use them again here because I think you can understand the magnitude of what impact it has or doesn't have on the event. For example, there's a government guarantee that says basically, thou must, I make it sound like the Ten Commandments, you shall, if you sign this, you shall provide people to immigrate into the country to watch the event and to leave. You cannot preempt them from any country at your border. So no matter what countries you're dealing with, you must allow them in to participate in the event. That's one. Another one, which I'm more closely outlined with, is the IT guarantee, which says basically the federal government shall provide all IT infrastructure to the event at no cost to FIFA or its nominees. Now, over the 7 World Cups that I've been a part of, there's only been a couple countries which have not been able to sign that guarantee. One of them is the U.S. We did not sign it in '94, nor did they sign it for the World Cup in 2026. And that's because they can't guarantee it, because commercially and otherwise a federal government cannot guarantee that. It can do things to help facilitate that, but it cannot guarantee that. Same thing is true about Canada. Canada would not sign or does not sign such a guarantee. All the countries that I've been a part of, including Mexico, which is part of 2026, has signed a guarantee to provide it. And in most countries, that's done through a facilitation of meetings and sessions with the federal government and their provision of services. And of course, you have to deal with the regulations that comes along with that from the federal government. Major staffing areas. One of the questions earlier today in a session asked me, basically, Dick, what's the key hurdle you have to cross? And the number one is people. You have to get people, not only people to do the work, but also people who have certification and qualification to do the work. And that is difficult to do in certain countries. Without naming names, there are certain countries where certification is not held in the highest regard. It's not as necessary for them to be successful. So the industry, in the 6 years leading up to the event, that certification for key technicians had to take place while we're doing that. So these are the basic components of the staffing model. First, there's the permanent staff from the sports federations. There's temporary organizations such as the local organizing committee and selected venue support staff. And in the case of Russia, for example, there are 11 cities that were part of the participation in the event. Each city had their own staffing for the local organizing element, and so they come from each one of those cities. Volunteers, you cannot put on any major sporting event in any location. This is guaranteed. I can guarantee you this. You cannot do it without volunteers. For the World Cup, we had close to 1,700 volunteers for IT only, close to 18,000 total throughout the different venues and so forth that were part of the volunteer program. And there's a very high dependency on that. And there's also, in most cases, government regulation as to what classifies as a volunteer. In most countries, unlike the US, volunteers must be paid. So it's difficult to sort of enumerate how that's going to happen, but it's a requirement. So the term volunteer may mean something different between one geographical presence and another. Then there are sponsor resources as part of the value in kind we talked about earlier. And finally, local market resources. We do feel we have to supplement some of them with local individuals from the local market who know the culture, know the language, and so forth. There's a core group that we would use from our company's perspective, whether it be Eurotech Global Sports or from EDS, that would travel from one of these events to the other. In most cases, we definitely had to increase our sensitivity to the culture and business and regulations of that country. As we always entered the country, I would always make the statement that, for example, I've done 6 World Cups, but I've never done one in Russia. So if you could help me along with this, I would appreciate it. So we would bring people in who have some of that sensitivity to help us with that. Some other major areas, structure makes a big difference. The single city region events are the basis of things like the Olympic Games. Although you might say that Olympics do have venues outside of a particular city, it's normally part of one city, one region. And one could argue that the next World Cup, which is in 2022, which is in Doha, in Qatar, I should say, but it's in Doha. It's in Qatar. If you look out the window of the location of the local organizing committee, you will see the location of all the venues, all 8 venues that are being constructed, because they're that close together. You can see them. So it's not as if we are in the same type of situation as in previous events. You also have challenges of multinational events, such as the 2022 World Cup that was in Japan and Korea, where you had to deal with the interaction and cultural development or communication between 2 countries. And we'll have to face the same thing in 2026 when United Bid initiates its process between the US, Canada, and Mexico. Facilities. One of the elements that these slide projects is that many people, when they think about the World Cup, they think about, well, it's the stadium that's the thing. That's partially true, and that is the primary focus for the match itself. But what one may not always understand is that there are venues and locations, key locations outside of that. The only part of this diagram which is in the stadium is on the bottom right, or bottom left, I should say, which is the broadcast compound, technology compound, stadium itself, volunteer center, stadium media center, ticketing center, so on and so on and so on. So that's the stadium. The rest of those all represent locations either within the venue city itself or outside of the country in some cases. So there are a lot of facilities that have to be considered in putting on a World Cup, and some of those are active for the entire 6.5 year or 4-year process leading up to the event. List of primary sites obviously includes the stadiums. As I said before, a majority of the stadiums for the past 7 World Cups have either been new or under major construction. So you'll see a lot of new stadiums. We can take questions about that if you have questions about where those are today. The one showing there on the top right is the construction that took place at the Johannesburg Stadium in South Africa. The other locations, which are primary locations, event headquarters is one location. Basically, for the period of the World Cup, everyone from FIFA relocates from Zurich, not everyone, they leave the receptionist, I think, relocates to the host country. So approximately 300 staff, now more likely 400 staff, move from Zurich to the host country during the period of the event. The event headquarters normally is a converted hotel into offices, or if you're lucky, it's an office building itself. IBC, International Broadcast Center, is another key location. Fan Fests, which is something that actually started in the Japan-Korea World Cup and has grown significantly over time. The bottom, the one you see there on the right, is in Rio de Janeiro, on the beach, which is where the Fan Fest was held. Simultaneously, as the matches happen, then the event is displayed there with services and so forth around it. So this happens quite often, well, not quite often, it happens in every World Cup now at almost every venue city for those that aren't fortunate enough to be able to get access to the stadium. And then another key location is accommodation, because accommodation quite often has to be increased for the event. So you'll see a lot of new hotels and so forth being built in the host country. The next part of this has to do with a temporary demand. And I guess to build upon this, in most cases, a stadium, I shouldn't say in most cases, in all cases, a stadium as it exists today is not ready, is not World Cup ready, because it has certain basic infrastructure, but has to have what we call an overlay of services on top of it. So the demand for overlay, for cable bridges and cable pathways and temporary buildings and temporary facilities is significant. The important thing is to make sure it's built upon a solid rock, a foundation, and that's where the basic infrastructure comes from. And it's also important to try to show that infrastructure to be seamless so that the connectivity and the connection and the working relationship between what exists and what you're bringing in is fine. Here's another key example of an overlay. That is, and this is something unique to a World Cup, unlike the Olympics and to a certain degree, and unlike the Super Bowl, the Britain press and broadcasters and so forth have the best seats in the house. They do. We take the best seats available, basically, in the mid-stride, and we convert close to, depending on the match, anywhere to 300 to 500 seats into media seats. And that's what you see there. So that's all temporary. That is all built just for the event itself. And as the event progresses, in some cases you'll see the facilities increase and decrease depending upon what the value the match has, and obviously from the beginning of the tournament, when there's the head-to-heads aren't as important, towards the end of the tournament when you have the quarterfinals, semifinals, and final matches, these will increase in size. And so you have to have that temporary infrastructure there. As well as media centers, media tribune, which is what we call here, broadcast compound, pitch side infrastructure, which is along the pitch. There's a significant implementation around the pitch itself, and all of which is temporary. A couple of unique locations that I want to point out. Someone asked me earlier what is the most my favorite World Cup stadium, and I don't have favorites. I have favorite grandchildren, but I don't have favorite stadiums. But there's some unique stories here. I mean, the Berlin Stadium, which shows you the type of construction that takes place. Here's a stadium that hosted the Olympic Games. It is a historic venue. It is the pride of Germany, if you will. Basically, they reconstructed this stadium and built infrastructure underneath it. And the way they did it was so unique in the fact that every stone, it's not a brick, every stone, which is a stone element, were numbered and were lettered to where they positioned in the stadium. They were taken off, they built the infrastructure, put the stones back. So historically, they would not lose the presence of the look of the venue itself. Now, that's great, it's fantastic, it's a story in and of itself, but it made the infrastructure implementation rather hard. It's hard to do that with a stadium that's built of that nature, but it was a fantastic venue to be a part of. Another story behind probably one of the more controversial stadiums, one of them that I've ever been a part of, and that is the one that's in Manaus, which is in the middle of the Amazon forest. There are only two ways to get there, really, unless you really want to drive a long ways. There's only two ways, by water or by plane. You can get there by boat, you can get there by plane. Otherwise, you can't get there. And it's at the intersection of the two major rivers, the Amazon and Negro River, and it's a famous city within the Amazon. When they were elected to use it, they elected it not because of its merits in technology or the value of the infrastructure there. They picked it because you cannot have a World Cup in Brazil without having a stadium in the Amazon. Why would one think that? So in the middle of the Amazon, there's a stadium, 45,000 seat stadium. And the last unique experience, I guess I would say, was during the final draw, which is the draw that actually places the teams into their positions for the World Cup. We spent about a month and a half inside the walls of the Russian government. It's basically like saying you were kind of like in the perimeter of the White House. And you had, your team was sitting there implementing the solution for telecommunications and broadcasting for the World Cup final draw. And that was definitely, security was quite significant. But honestly, the important thing is once you got through the initial security process, you could go anywhere you wanted to go, basically. I mean, I couldn't go talk to the president, Mr. Putin, but we could go almost anywhere. And it was quite the experience to be part of that inside the Red Square in Moscow. Okay, I'm going to spend just a few minutes. I mean, I assume there's some IT people in the room. Is that correct? Yeah, okay. So there are there's a few event-related items that need to be discussed, which are unique to a World Cup, and you do not see them in many other places. The first is the unique network configuration. And the first is to make sure that the solutions are based on proven technologies. You'll later hear me say you should base your solutions on leading edge, not bleeding edge. I mean, you want to be able to say that we've built a solution such that it can work, obviously basing on the most current solution, but you don't want to base it on things that are going to possibly have a problem. The second thing is to make sure we have the highest, what we call redundancy. Some would say redundancy is redundant, but redundancy possible, both from a physical and commercial aspect. What's meant by that is we have requirements for network connectivity at the ability of 99.99% availability, which means basically during the period of the World Cup, you could be down for 7 minutes at some point, based on just pure timing. The only requirement is that 7 minutes can't happen during a match. So other than that, you can take it down anytime. The point is that the infrastructure is designed so that you have automatic failover from one segment of the network to the other. So that, and this is basically a broadcast requirement that makes continual broadcasting possible. And there is no downtime of broadcast signal to the world. Try to leverage the existing infrastructure as much as possible. And we have to adapt it according to World Cup requirements. So this particular configuration for the Russian World Cup, we had let me pull this up here, 25 gigabyte service on each leg, if you will, of the solution. So it's 25 redundant, which is higher than most stadiums have on a single leg. Mobility related requirements. Mobility is something that someone asked me earlier what one of the major changes in the delivery of services, and that is mobility. The ability to accommodate mobile services. There's been a significant increase in this over the past 2 World Cups, to where the key constituent groups, which include the FIFA staff, as well as broadcasters and media, have a high expectation of what's going to be done. Mobile voice data with high reliability so that there's no downtime in what's happening. Wi-Fi in the stadium to support the offload of data traffic and key fan interaction. What is meant by that basically is, I'm sure most of you have seen video of what happens at the very beginning of a World Cup match or a Super Bowl match or whatever the case might be. You see the kickoff, and what do you see? You see flashes. You see people taking photos of what just happened. Well, what happens to those photos? Those photos get uploaded somewhere and sent. And up until recently, the collection of that, obviously taking the photo is not the issue, transmitting that photo then elsewhere in an infrastructure in a single stadium can be very difficult when everybody's doing it at the same time. If we just take turns, it would be okay. But for some reason, we just don't take turns. People expect to do it when they do it. It's instantaneous. It's got to be there. So we have to rely on reliable services for that, which requires some unique infrastructure. The other thing is, on top of that layer of mobility, is what we call Tetra services, which is what one may call walkie-talkie or trunk radio services, which are operational in nature. They're the ones that the actual security and other elements supporting the event are part of. There are other key commercial use of mobile services, ticketing. Almost every event now, and including the 2018 World Cup, begins to put in place electronic ticketing so that you're able to scan from a device. Payment service, contactless payment services, so that you can pay for things with your phone, if you will, with your mobile device. In-seat food and beverage. It wasn't done as much in 2018 for the World Cup, but almost every venue that I've seen visited that has modernized infrastructure now has in-seat food and beverage services. Access control, including fan identification. Access control means ways to get into the stadium, whether it be accreditation or by ticketing. But the other element, which was done in Russia for the first time at Sochi and then again at the 2018 World Cup, is that no one was able to attend an event with just a ticket. A ticket would not get you in. You had to be also be able to identify to have completed a background check. A background check from the FSB, which previously was the KGB, but now they're FSB. Sounds softer. And they were responsible for ensuring that you had the background check. So you had two devices. You had what looked like an accreditation, but it was just a fan ID. And this was done both in Sochi at the Olympic Games and during the World Cup. So you're talking 1.5 million plus people who went through a fan identification system. And this was even, in most cases, was even necessary, would act as your visa coming into the country. So it would allow you not only into the stadium, but also in some countries where required, would be part of the visa process. And the other thing is we need what's called indoor and outdoor coverage, which means you not only have to deal with inside the stadium, but all the areas that are located outside the stadium. What you see there are what we call cows. And maybe you know about cows, but these are cells on wheels, which are part of temporary infrastructure for mobile telephony, and you'll see them quite often at different events and so forth. Some of the things we have to manage very heavily are the expectations of certain key groups, including broadcasters and written press. There are a large group of people which are part of the broadcast rights holders. They're called, both have what's called multilateral and unilateral services, which basically means you get more than one service or you get a single service. Depends on the type of services that you need. But these are media rights holders. They have agreed with FIFA, and all countries, almost all of the 208 member association countries have some form of media rights licensee covering their location. Come to agreement with FIFA to have rights to do certain things. This includes radio and television broadcasts, and now more heavily broadband and mobile operators. That infrastructure I talked about earlier is part of what they call contribution network, which is the wide area network that links the stadiums and all key locations to an international gateway, and it does it with the highest level of compression technology, which is use of strong adaptation equipment, which adjusts the compression to a very high level, so you can try to minimize the amount of bandwidth actually needed. Many people confuse the fact that satellites appear at events like the World Cup as a primary communication source. That's not true. The World Cup only uses satellite transmission as backup to the backup. I've been, on the 7 World Cups I've been a part of, we've never used satellite transmission as a necessity. We've always had the backup work, I guess is the way to look at it. And then, of course, you talk about compression technology. One needs to also take a look at the fact that we're transitioning now from the expectations being from 4K, which is where we are basically now transitioning to 8K. And that you'll see more and more coming into the World Cup in Qatar. And I think it will be obviously here during the 2026 World Cup. Media services, this is the written press, photographers. They require cabled infrastructure for services. And they require it at certain locations where the bandwidth is necessary to help them produce services. Photographers are probably one of the ones we've seen the most changes in recently, and that deals with the use of, not every camera comes with a photographer, I guess is the way to look at it. Photographers now carry multiple cameras, and now they position those cameras, whether it be in the ring above the stadium or whether it be around the pitch, but they're robotic in nature. So they take pictures they take multiple pictures almost instantaneously, but they're managed through a different methodology than having a photographer sit and take the picture. They definitely are automated to the highest degree. The other network element, which we won't spend a lot of time with, maybe some of you who are more network oriented may want to talk about at a later point. We have used for the past several World Cups what's called port level network access control, port identification, which basically means you can't just take your laptop, go plug it in a port, and it's going to connect into the network that we're talking about. You have to have a certain level of certification on your device, and you have to have a certain level of access process in place already authenticated before you can actually receive services. Otherwise, you go on to what we call a guest VLAN, which is along with everybody else. We manage the load very heavily so that we don't have any misuse of resources. The second item is the Goalline Technology, which has come through an interesting process. I mean, the FIFA had looked at the sport of football, soccer, and said basically, it's pure, it's great. It used to be that they didn't want any intervention at all. That has changed over the past several years to where Goalline Technology, the positioning of the 37 cameras around the stadium during a World Cup, is meant solely for the purpose of determining whether a ball has crossed a line or not. It may sound fundamental to you, but there have been historic situations where a ball maybe crossed the line, and it cost a match to be determined one way or the other. So because of the importance of the event, Goalline Technology was put in place and is now used heavily across all professional leagues. Then there's the video assistant referee. It's similar to, but not the same as some of the football things that are going, the U.S. American football things. There is a series of connections and additional cameras which are put in place for use by assistant referees for determining if a certain action has taken place to nullify or to add advantage to one team or the other. Now, just like with the American football process, this happens even if the referee doesn't do the rectangle thing, which is the signal for I'm going to VAR. What happens, it happens during the World Cup, it happened about 7 times, an average about 7 times per match, where the women and men, sitting in the VAR booth would determine which of those two, if any video replay should be done, and then signaling that to the referees, beyond the referee signal for VAR. That's technology that has been implemented and which has been and will be used on an ongoing basis for World Cups. The other is the electronic performance and tracking system, EPTS, which basically collects data about an individual. What you'll see quite often in what has become the ceremonial take my shirt off after a goal process is you'll see them pull the shirt off, pull the jersey over their head, and you'll see this black thing around. It looks like they're wearing a bra of some sort. And what it is that there is a black device around them with a chip in the back, and that chip tracks their presence on the pitch, actually tracks also some significant information of heart rate and so forth, and information that is then collected, that is then used for competition elements. You can tell whether, and it would be the case, Dick Wiles was getting tired running on the pitch, which he would see almost immediately, that you would be able to determine that you better take him out and put somebody else in his place. So there's both tracking that's being done there through wearables now. Okay, ready to go through some lessons learned, but I think first of all, since I've ran through this rather quickly, I'd rather open it up for questions, yeah? See if there's any questions from in the group that I can try to answer. So Lord, we have a microphone up here if you wish to.
I got two of them for you.
Okay.
First one's a little bit lighter. So with your work with FIFA now, are you more of a soccer fan or are you still a football fan?
Well, first of all, let's make sure we're clear. I'm from Nebraska, so I am a football fan, American football fan. And Ohio State, watch out, because we're coming. Okay? So I've always been an American football fan. I played when I was a kid. But when the story I told about my son and coaching my son, I actually did play then too in Texas. And I had several people teach me some very valuable lessons playing in Dallas, playing the sport. So I'm a fan of soccer, of the international football, if you will. But I am not yet what I would classify, even after 7 World Cups, I'm not a fanatic. I don't, and maybe that's partly the fault of the United States soccer team, I don't know. But not the women by any means. Women have done their job, but the men may not have. So. But yeah, I enjoy the sport. Yeah.
So for the second one, and we saw this in Rio with the Olympics, where new facilities were built, and then after the event was over, they kind of decayed into nothingness. Does that happen with some of the new stadiums that are built for World Cup events?
I would love to tell you it does not, but it does. I mean, and I don't want to beat on Brazil but if you I was going to bring them, but I decided not to. Photos of 2 of the stadium in Brazil. One is Manaus, the stadium I was talking about. Not used by any club. It's unused at this point. It is overgrown now with incredible wear, even after it's been new. The other one that's even sadder is Maracanã. Maracanã, for those that may or may not know, is the church. It's the church of Brazilian soccer. It's in Rio where the world knows soccer. Maracanã is a historic stadium, and it is in dire repair. And it's incredible that it's gotten to this point. But there are white elephants currently, including many in South Africa, a few in Brazil. There'll be some in Russia, I'm sure, as well. The one saving grace to a certain degree, and Qatar will have some as well. I mean, they're building 8 stadiums.
That was my favorite.
Building 8, and one of them is a Lego stadium, by the way. They're thinking a little bit ahead, because it's what I call a Lego stadium. Basically, they're building it with containers. I don't know if you know the containers that you put on a truck, but they're building it with containers. It's a container stadium. And so at the end of the day, they're going to just take it apart. Almost all stadium of a certain size are downsized after a World Cup. They actually are moved from the requirement of 45,000 seats down to something more reasonable for a local club or whatever. But even then you see some of the white elephants that are there, and it's unfortunate. The one saving grace, and I'll just add this and then go on to the next question, is that for the 2026 World Cup, except perhaps for Mexico a little bit, but in the US, for example, there are 17 cities bidding for 10 slots. And of those 17 cities, they're all stadiums that have been in use, basically, and can handle the seating capacity, maybe not some of the infrastructure requirements, but seating capacity that are necessary. So I don't anticipate that they'll be building a lot of new stuff in 2026, but you'll see it in 2022, and you have seen it in the past. And I don't think, I don't see where it's ever going to go to a situation where you have whether someone has suggested a single venue that always hosts the Olympic Games or always hosts the World Cup. I don't see that really happening. Good question. Other question? Way over there. You can yell if you want. Networking, the data networking, or networking like dealing with social networking. Well, I could lie to you and say social networking is really, really great for me. My wife is in the audience, so. I will say, well, let me say it this way. Once you get into an industry, I talked about the doors that have been opened and so forth. The individuals that have opened some of those doors are individuals that were part of a social business network, that's for sure. So it has affected my ability to get some of those doors open. They have been able to facilitate some of the work that has been done. And once you get into an industry specific, in the case of sports and IT and so forth, it's a very small community of people. So to get the next opportunity, the next door that's going to be open based on that in that community, it's been very good. So I would have to say, yeah, it's had a major impact. I don't know that I would always say that it's not who you know that makes the difference, but it is. You need to be prepared for the time when that person who knows you will open a door that you can go into. Now, again, it's something that I think is very important to know that there are opportunities where the doors are going to open, you're going to want to walk through it, and others when you're not. So, but it's been important, I would say. Other questions? There's one back here.
So working with the industry of technology and cybersecurity, how do you prioritize a multi-million-dollar budget towards the technology industry? I know you said that the governments are the ones that provide all the IT. How do they prioritize? How much money is going towards that?
Make sure I understand your question. You're asking how much of the overall budget?
Like, how do they prioritize how much of their budget is going to go towards technology and cybersecurity?
Well, I would like to say that they know exactly what they need to spend and they can ideally prioritize it before. But as I said earlier, the requirements for the event, like a World Cup, are fairly large, and understanding those requirements is somewhat difficult. So the prioritization of that becomes difficult. In the overall scheme of things, I would have to say that in most cases, I'm thinking quickly through most cases, the expectation of what needs to be done is different than what has to be done, if that makes sense. And that gap doesn't go away, and that gap is where most of the cost actually comes from. And so they do a good job of prioritizing what they know, but they don't do a very good job of understanding the gap and knowing how to make that function. So in most cases, from an IT perspective, they do end up spending more than what they thought they were going to spend. That's for sure. Yeah. There was a question back there. Then we'll come back to you again.
What's your favorite soccer team?
I would have to, let me think about that for a second. I would say the Pride under 13 soccer team in Colorado Springs, Colorado. Yeah? Is that a good answer?
Yeah.
I'm a Liverpool fan. Someone told me they were a Barcelona fan. Rough year. But yeah, and yours?
Manchester United.
There you go. Yeah.
Or Cristiano Ronaldo or Lionel Messi.
What's that?
Cristiano Ronaldo Messi, which one do you prefer?
Owen Malik. He's my grandson, by the way. I personally, I'm not a very verbose person, personally. So my vote would go Messi. I'm just, yeah.
Yeah, Team Messi.
Yeah, there we go. Messi's the man. There was a question.
What percentage of the IT staff would you say is security analysts? Like, if you could even just give a rough, like how many security specialists would they plan out?
It would be a low percentage. I mean, we're talking about a very low percentage. And it's not such a, I mean, it's part of it is because, not that there isn't a priority put on
You don't need that
security.
many.
When you say security analyst, you mean network security. You don't, yeah. Because security, physical security is a whole different thing.
Right.
You saw them everywhere. They see you there. But network security is a very low percentage. And it's not because there isn't a buy-in in the network security aspects, it's because the architecture takes away, and because of the temporary aspect of the architecture, it takes away the requirement for heavy security presence from a network perspective. We monitor, you saw the IT command center. In the IT command center, we monitor activity in all networks, and we shut things down almost automatically when we have DOS or something along those lines that makes it necessary to do so. But we don't get as much of that as you would think in a normal business, for example, because we were very temporary and we're very heavy in the types of elements we put in place. So. Any other questions? If not, I think I just have one more slide and then we can probably call it a day. These are some of the overall lessons learned. If you take any of these away, great. If you don't, that's your... From a project perspective, someone asked me earlier, when do you start? All I know is you can never start too soon. I mean, when you start executing and planning, you can, if you know what you need to do, then you should start. And one of the things we always had as an adage when we worked is, the one thing we cannot get a sponsor for is time. No one can sponsor time for us. They can't give us more of it. And this is the kind of, for those of you who are in the IT industry, this is not one of the projects you can come to your manager and say, I need a few days delay because I'm not going to have this ready by then. Doesn't work. Doesn't work. What we're doing is going to start, and you better be ready for it to start. Surround yourself with good people and empower them. It's two key things. I mean, you can have a lot of good people and not give them empowerment, but if you do both, then, like me, I can just stand and watch. It's sort of cool. You know, I just don't have to do anything. There are very few substitutions for experience. Doesn't mean you can't bring people on a project who don't have experience, because how are they going to get it if you don't? But the important thing is you'd have to have some level of people who are managing from an experience perspective. As I said earlier a little bit, you want to be using components which are on the leading edge and not the bleeding edge. We have an adage, we always want to proactively, we don't want to wait for something to happen. We want to be able to proactively monitor wherever we can to make sure we know when something's going to happen before it happens, which is quite often the case in a workup perspective. And those in the audience who know me know this adage, nothing is free. Quite often, someone expects either from a sponsor or from an entity to have something that costs you nothing, and you should take it and run. But I tell you that in most cases, you're not going to get something and not have some expectation for a result or an element to come back to you. So those are the kinds of lessons learned, I guess, I can put in front of you. So if there aren't other questions, I thank you for your time and thank you for your attention and your questions, and I hope you have a good rest of your day.